The cold iron of the blade pierced the skull with a dull sound, like wood cracking. Dark blood ran down the stained snow, forming small crimson streams that disappeared among the wreckage of shattered armor and torn banners. There, on that somber January morning in 1477, lay the man who had made Europe tremble, now unrecognizable, with his face crushed and his naked body stripped of all dignity. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, had met his end not in glory, but in the freezing mud of Nancy, transformed from a feared conqueror into an anonymous corpse. Just 2 days earlier, this same man commanded the last army of his boundless ambitions. Charles of Burgundy had grown in power like few in medieval history, heir to territories stretching from the Low Countries to the borders of Switzerland, controlling Europe's most profitable trade routes. His domains shone with the wealth of the Flemish cities, where weavers created tapestries that adorned royal palaces and merchants amassed fortunes rivaling crowns. From a young age, Charles displayed a personality that teetered between brilliance and danger. His dark eyes, always restless, carried an intensity that made courtiers avert their gazes. When he spoke, his deep voice echoed through the halls of the ducal palace with an authority that brooked no contradiction. In 1467, at 24 years old, Charles assumed the duchy upon the death of his father, Philip the Good. The transition of power immediately revealed his ruthless nature. Where Philip had ruled with diplomacy and balance, Charles brought an insatiable thirst to expand borders and assert his independence. He was not content to remain a vassal of the King of France. He dreamed of restoring the ancient kingdom of Burgundy and perhaps even of seizing an imperial crown. His early years as Duke were marked by a series of military campaigns that expanded his territories and cemented his reputation as a merciless commander. In Liège, a rebellious city that dared challenge his authority, Charles demonstrated the brutality that would become his trademark. After besieging it for months, he ordered it to be burned to the ground, leaving only ashes and corpses as a testament to his mercy. Philippe de Comines, chronicler and advisor who served both Charles and his enemies, wrote in his memoirs about the terror the Duke inspired even in his own men. His wrath was a storm that destroyed everything in its path, Comines reported. And when his eyes flared with anger, even the bravest captains trembled. The Duke had developed the habit of walking through the military camps at night, clad in black armor that made him resemble a sinister wraith among the soldiers' campfires. His presence was at once inspiring and terrifying, for all knew that Charles would not hesitate to personally execute anyone he deemed a traitor or coward. Burgundy's wealth allowed Charles to maintain one of the most modern armies in Europe. His bronze cannons, cast by the finest Flemish artisans, could breach the thickest walls. His troops included English mercenaries armed with longbows, disciplined German pikemen, and the feared Burgundian heavy cavalry, whose polished armor reflected the sunlight like deadly mirrors. On the battlefield, Charles stood out like a colossus, clad in black steel, wielding a two-handed sword that had belonged to his great-grandfather. His victories at Granson and Morat against the Swiss Confederates initially confirmed his reputation for invincibility, but also revealed the first signs of his destructive obsession. Charles's court was a reflection of his complex and contradictory personality. During banquets in Brussels or Bruges, the Duke could display exceptional refinement, debating literature with Italian humanists or admiring paintings by Flemish masters. His personal library contained illuminated manuscripts of inestimable value, including chronicles of Charlemagne that fueled his dreams of imperial greatness. Yet this same cultural sophistication coexisted with episodes of sudden violence that shocked even the courtiers most accustomed to medieval brutality. During one dinner, Charles allegedly smashed a golden goblet against the head of a noble who questioned his military decisions, leaving the man bleeding while other guests pretended not to have seen anything. The women of the court developed a keen sense for the Duke's moods. Lady Margaret of York, his third wife and sister of King Edward IV of England, learned to recognize the signs that preceded his fits of rage. When Charles clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, she confided in a letter to her brother, "We all knew it was time to slip away in silence." Margaret had married Charles in 1468, in a ceremony that lasted 15 days and cost the equivalent of a small kingdom's annual budget. The union sealed an alliance between Burgundy and England against France, but also trapped Margaret in a marriage with a man whose thirst for power grew with each passing year. Foreign ambassadors who visited the Burgundian court reported in their dispatches the atmosphere of constant tension that surrounded the Duke. The Venetian representative Antonio Dandolo wrote to the Doge in 1475 that Duke Charles exudes a terrible majesty, as if he carries with him the weight of storms about to break upon the world. Dandolo described how Charles granted audiences seated on an ebony throne adorned with rubies, wearing a velvet black tunic that absorbed the light around him, creating an almost supernatural effect. His ducal crown, a masterpiece of Gothic goldsmithing, seemed too heavy for his head, yet Charles wore it with obsessive pride, as if it were a talisman of his power. Music and art flourished at court, but always under the watchful eye of an unpredictable lord. Charles patronized composers like Antoine Busnois, whose polyphonic masses resonated through ducal chapels with a melancholic beauty that seemed to foreshadow tragic ends. Painters Hans Memling and Hugo van der Goes created portraits of the ducal family that captured not only their outward wealth, but also a profound sadness in their eyes. One portrait of Margaret of York, now lost, supposedly showed almost imperceptible tears in her blue eyes, and detailed Charles allegedly ordered covered with golden paint. As the years passed, Charles's obsession with territorial expansion intensified to a near pathological degree. He began sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night, rising before dawn to study maps and plan campaigns. His servants reported that the Duke was found wandering the palace corridors in the hours before sunrise, mumbling military strategies to himself as if conversing with ghosts. His meals became increasingly Spartan. Charles often ate only bread and wine for days on end, claiming that excess food made commanders lazy. The Duke's physical transformation began to become visible around 1475. His dark hair, once carefully coiffed, started turning prematurely grey, and he developed the habit of plucking at his hair when anxious, leaving small bald spots he tried to hide under hats or helmets. His hands, once steady when holding swords or quills, began to tremble slightly during moments of stress. The court physicians prescribed regular bloodletting to calm his hot humors, but Charles refused most treatments, insisting that only military victory could cure his restlessness. The Swiss campaign of 1476 marked the beginning of his downfall. Charles had completely underestimated the determination and military skill of the Alpine Confederates, treating them as rebellious peasants easily subdued. At the Battle of Grandson, in March that year, his army suffered a humiliating defeat. The Swiss not only routed the Burgundian troops, but also captured a treasure of artillery, including the famed cannons Charles believed to be invincible. Among the spoils lost was his personal ducal seal and several religious relics he carried as lucky charms. The news of the defeat reached the court like a thunderbolt. Margaret of York, according to contemporary chroniclers, fainted upon hearing that her husband had lost not only a battle, but much of his reputation for invincibility. Courtiers began whispering in the corridors, questioning for the first time whether Charles truly possessed the divine protection he always claimed. The Duke himself, when he returned to Brussels a few weeks later, appeared physically diminished. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, as though he had lost weight rapidly, and his eyes had acquired a feverish quality that frightened those who had known him for years. But Charles, instead of accepting defeat as a sign to reconsider his ambitions, interpreted it as a test of his determination. He began speaking obsessively about washing dishonor away with Swiss blood, and ordered the mobilization of even greater resources for a new campaign. Documents from the time show he drained the ducal treasury, sold crown jewels, and even pledged properties to finance another army. His letters to Margaret became increasingly incoherent, mixing declarations of love with grandiose fantasies about conquering all of Central Europe. The second Swiss expedition, which culminated in the Battle of Morat in June 1476, was even more disastrous than the first. Charles had assembled around 20,000 men, including Italian, German, and English mercenaries. But his leadership had become erratic and unpredictable. Witnesses reported that during the siege of Morat, the Duke sometimes stood for hours in silence, staring at the city walls as if expecting them to collapse by the force of his will. Other times, he erupted into fits of rage that left his commanders confused about his true intentions. The defeat at Morat was complete and humiliating. The Swiss not only repelled the siege, but pursued the fleeing Burgundian army, massacring thousands of soldiers trying to escape through marshes and forests. Charles lost nearly all his artillery again, as well as his personal carriage that contained intimate correspondence with Margaret and other compromising documents. Among the dead was Pierre de Hagenbach, one of his most loyal commanders, whose execution by the Swiss weeks earlier had been one of the motivations for Charles's quest for revenge. Charles's return to his domains after Morat revealed a broken man, though he refused to admit it. Witnesses described his appearance as spectral, with clothes soiled by mud and blood, hair disheveled, and a gaze that seemed to see nothing of the real world around him. Margaret tried to convince him to abandon his military ambitions and focus on administering his remaining territories. But Charles responded to such suggestions with outbursts of fury that terrified the entire court. During one of these arguments, he allegedly smashed valuable furniture and shouted that he would rather die than live as a provincial duke. Charles's obsession with restoring his honor led him to make a fateful decision: the invasion of Lorraine. René II, the young Duke of Lorraine, had allied himself with the Swiss and the French, and Charles saw his defeat as essential to maintaining a land corridor between his northern and southern territories. In October 1476, with only about 8,000 men, a fraction of what he had commanded in earlier campaigns, Charles began what would be his final military expedition. The siege of Nancy began in November, with winter rapidly approaching. Conditions were deplorable from the outset. Constant rains turned the Burgundian camp into an infected quagmire where disease spread quickly. Charles, however, seemed oblivious to his men's discomfort. He had pitched his tent at the highest point in the camp, from which he could constantly observe Nancy's walls, as if his vigilance could force the city's surrender. Letters Charles wrote during the siege, some of which survive in Austrian archives, reveal the Duke's deteriorating mental state. In one addressed to Margaret, he wrote, "My beloved wife, angels visit me every night and assure me that Nancy will fall before Christmas. Charlemagne appeared to me in my dreams wearing my armor and told me that my destiny is to reunite his empire." These mystical visions, which Charles described in vivid detail, troubled his commanders, but no one dared openly question the Duke's sanity. The situation in the camp worsened day by day. Food began to dwindle as supply lines were cut by French cavalry raids. Soldiers, many of whom had not been paid for months, started deserting in small groups at night. Charles responded to these desertions by ordering public executions that only further lowered troop morale. Olivier de la Marche, court chronicler and witness to the Duke's final days, described how Charles sometimes walked among the campfires at midnight, wearing only a dirty shirt and talking to himself in dialects no one understood. December's cold brought a new layer of suffering to the siege. Snow began to fall heavily, covering the camp with a white shroud that hid the filth and death but could not mask the stench of decomposing bodies and human waste. Charles had lost so much weight that his armor had to be refitted multiple times by camp blacksmiths. His eyes, once bright and intimidating, had become sunken and ringed with dark circles, giving him a cadaverous appearance. During Christmas of 1476, Charles refused to celebrate any festivities, claiming there would be no joy until Nancy was in his hands. He spent the day alone in his tent, refusing even the company of his chaplains. Nearby soldiers reported hearing moans and screams from the ducal tent throughout the night, but no one dared investigate. The next morning, Charles emerged with scratches on his face that he claimed were inflicted by demons who tried to prevent me from praying. The arrival of 1477 brought devastating news to the Burgundian camp. René of Lorraine had gathered a relief army that included not only French troops, but also veteran Swiss contingents from previous victories against Charles. The Duke received this information with a disturbingly calm, almost supernatural demeanor. Instead of considering a strategic retreat, he announced that the moment of his final battle had come, using terms more appropriate for a religious crusade than a conventional military campaign. In the last days before the battle, Charles exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. He ordered his men to fast for 3 days to purify their souls before the sacred combat, a decision that left already weakened troops even more vulnerable. During this period, the Duke spent hours kneeling before a portable crucifix, murmuring Latin prayers and occasionally bursting into tears, audible across the camp. Charles's final letter to Margaret, dated January 4th, 1477, is a disturbing document that fully reveals his deteriorated mental state. "Dearest Margaret," he wrote in trembling handwriting barely resembling his usual script, "today I received a vision from the Virgin Mary, who told me that my death will bring eternal glory to the House of Burgundy. Do not weep for me when this letter arrives, for I will be seated at the right hand of God, judging my enemies for all eternity." The letter, stained with what appeared to be tears or blood, never reached its destination. The morning of January 5th, 1477 dawned with a thick fog covering the fields around Nancy. Charles had spent the entire night awake, pacing circles inside his tent while murmuring incomprehensible strategies. When his commanders came to inform him of the enemy army's approach, they found the Duke wearing armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather, a museum piece offering inadequate protection, but which he insisted held mystical powers. The formation of the Burgundian army that morning was chaotic and poorly coordinated. Charles had completely abandoned the tactical principles that had made him famous, opting for a massive frontal charge that ignored lessons learned from previous defeats. His men, hungry and demoralized, followed orders more out of fear than loyalty. Many had already decided to desert at the first opportunity, but the speed of events gave them no chance. When the enemy lines became visible through the fog, Charles let out a war cry that echoed across the battlefield. Witnesses described the sound as something between an animal roar and a human lament, a vocalization that chilled even battle-hardened veterans. He spurred his horse, a black destrier he had ridden in dozens of battles, and led the charge with a desperate ferocity that seemed more suicidal than strategic. The Battle of Nancy was more a massacre than an organized combat. The Burgundian troops, outnumbered and poorly positioned, were quickly outflanked. Charles, at the heart of the chaos, fought like a man possessed, his sword swinging in wild arcs while his horse trampled fallen bodies. Several witnesses reported seeing him laugh hysterically as he killed, a sound that seemed to rise above the battle's roar like a madman's music. The exact moment of Charles's death remains shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Some witnesses claimed he was unhorsed by a Swiss pike and then trampled by enemy cavalry. Others suggest he was surrounded by a group of Lorraine soldiers who did not recognize him until it was too late. The most detailed account comes from a German mercenary who alleged he was close enough to see Charles fall. The Duke fought like 10 men, but blood flowed from his armor in several places. When he finally fell, he tried to rise twice before lying still. What is certain is that Charles's body was not identified immediately after the battle. In the chaos of victory, the triumphant soldiers focused on looting the dead and pursuing the fleeing. The Duke of Burgundy's corpse lay among hundreds of others, stripped of his valuable armor and left naked in the snow, which quickly turned red with the blood of thousands of men. The search for Charles's body began 2 days later, when it became clear that the Duke had vanished completely. René of Lorraine, concerned about the political implications of having killed one of Europe's most powerful nobles, ordered a systematic search among the fallen. The task was macabre. Hundreds of frozen, mutilated corpses had to be examined one by one, many already being eaten by dogs and crows that had gathered on the battlefield. The man who finally identified Charles was Olivier de la Marche, the court chronicler who had served the ducal family for decades. Called upon to aid in identification, de la Marche traversed the battlefield with a growing expression of horror. When he finally found what remained of his lord, he reportedly fell to his knees in the snow and vomited violently. The body that had commanded armies and intimidated kings was unrecognizable, with its skull shattered and face mangled beyond any possibility of visual identification. The final identification had to be made through bodily marks known only to those closest to the Duke. Charles had a distinctive scar on his left shoulder from a youthful wound, and a finger on his right hand that had been broken and improperly healed years before. More macabre still, de la Marche had to examine the Duke's remaining teeth, some of which had been replaced with gold prosthetics unique in design. The discovery of the body set off a chain reaction that shook all of Europe. Margaret of York, upon receiving the news in Brussels, locked herself in her chambers for 3 days, refusing food or visitors. When she finally emerged, witnesses reported that her hair had turned nearly white during those 3 days of mourning. She was never seen to smile again, court records say, and would spend the rest of her life wearing only black. Charles's funeral in Nancy was a surreal ceremony that reflected the tragedy of his death. His body, so mutilated, it had to be completely covered during the service, was placed in a simple wooden coffin, a final humiliation for a man who had lived surrounded by imperial luxury. René of Lorraine, genuinely disturbed by his enemy's death, arranged a solemn mass, but the ceremony was constantly interrupted by drunken soldiers celebrating their victory outside the church. The political consequences of Charles's death were immediate and devastating for the Burgundian legacy. His territories fragmented almost instantly, with France annexing the Duchy of Burgundy proper, while the Low Countries passed into Habsburg control through Mary of Burgundy's marriage to Maximilian of Austria. The dream of an independent Burgundian kingdom died with its creator in those frozen fields of Nancy. Yet the legend of Charles the Bold was only beginning. In the months following his death, increasingly fantastical stories of his final days began to circulate. Some claimed he had been seen alive after the battle, wandering the fields as a ghost in search of vengeance. Others whispered that his body had been secretly removed from the grave and taken to a monastery, where monks attempted to resurrect him through magical rituals. Philippe de Comines, in his famous memoirs written years later, offered a sobering reflection on the tragedy. Charles was a man who possessed all the qualities necessary for greatness, except the most essential one, the knowledge of his own limits. His ambition was as vast as the sky, But his judgment was as flawed as a child's. He died not because he was weak, but because he refused to accept that even the most powerful must bow before reality. Charles's transformation from respected, a duke to tragic figure, fascinated later generations of writers and historians. His story contains archetypal elements that would echo through literature. The ruler whose pride causes his own destruction. The brilliant general whose hubris leads to ruin. The powerful man who loses everything for not knowing when to stop. These themes would resonate through the centuries in works ranging from Shakespeare to George R.R. Martin, who explicitly acknowledged Charles as an inspiration for characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. The psychological impact of Charles's death on his contemporaries was profound and lasting. An entire generation of European nobles had grown up believing in the Burgundian duke's invincibility, and his sudden, violent demise served as a brutal reminder of human power's fragility. Letters and diaries from the time reveal an almost existential terror that spread through European courts. If Charles the Bold could die naked and unrecognizable in the freezing mud, what real security did any of them truly possess? Margaret of York never fully recovered from her husband's loss. She lived 36 years beyond his death, but was consistently described as a haunted woman, often seen talking to Charles's portraits or walking palace gardens in the earliest morning hours, when the mist created shadows she sometimes mistook for her dead husband's silhouette. She commissioned several works of art in his memory, including an altarpiece in Bruges Cathedral depicting Charles received in paradise by warrior saints, a grotesque contrast with the brutal reality of his death. Charles's influence on art and literature of his time was significant and enduring. Composers wrote requiems in his memory that were simultaneously majestic and melancholic, capturing the duality of a man who had been both inspiring and terrifying. Hans Memling, who had painted portraits of the ducal family for years, created a disturbing masterpiece titled The Death of Charles, depicting the Duke in his final moments surrounded by allegorical figures representing ambition, pride, and fate. Charles's grand dreams continued to haunt the European imagination long after his death. Documents discovered in the ducal archives reveal detailed plans for campaigns extending as far as Constantinople and Rome. Projects so ambitious they seemed more fantasy than viable military strategies. Among his personal papers were maps, annotated in his own hand, showing routes of conquest that would cover all of Central Europe and parts of the Mediterranean. Charles's armor, recovered from the battlefield days after his death, became a macabre relic passed down through the centuries. Stained with blood that could never be fully removed, the armor bore marks of dozens of strikes that had pierced its metal. Each dent and scratch recounted part of the story of his final moments, and noble collectors paid fortunes just to touch it, as if they could absorb some of the Duke's lost power. Charles's personal library, one of the most impressive in Europe, was dispersed after his death, but some illuminated manuscripts survived and reveal intimate aspects of his personality. In the margins of historical chronicles, he had written commentary in multiple languages, some reflective and insightful, others showing growing paranoia about conspiracies and betrayals. A manuscript about Charlemagne contained dense annotations, where Charles seemed to be conversing directly with the long-dead emperor, seeking advice on strategy and governance. The last servants of Charles, who survived the Battle of Nancy, carried disturbing stories about the Duke's final days. Jean de Hénin, his personal squire, recounted in a deposition recorded years later that Charles had stopped sleeping entirely. In the final 2 weeks before the battle, he wandered ceaselessly, Heinin recalled, sometimes talking to people who were not there, other times reciting the names of every man he had killed as if it were a prayer or confession. The Duke's physical deterioration during the siege was documented by multiple independent sources. Olivier de la Marche wrote that Charles had lost so much weight that his ducal crown no longer fit securely on his head, wobbling when he moved. His hands, once strong enough to break bones with a sword, trembled constantly, and he developed a nervous tic that made him blink rapidly when agitated. More disturbing still, his pupils had become permanently dilated, giving his eyes a glassy quality that made people avoid his gaze. The court physician, Master Guillaume de Vary, kept detailed records of Charles's decline, only discovered in the 19th century. His notes reveal a pattern of symptoms modern specialists would recognize as extreme psychological stress and possible mental collapse. The Duke can no longer distinguish between dreams and waking, de Varier wrote in December 1476. He constantly asks me about wounds that do not exist and claims to feel pain in limbs that have not been injured. His prayers have turned into conversations with dead saints he swears are present in his tent. Charles's religiosity, always intense, became obsessive in his final months. He began wearing a cilice, a rough horsehair shirt used by penitents, under his armor, causing wounds that became infected and emitted a putrid odor detectable by his soldiers from yards away. During masses in the camp, Charles prostrated himself completely on the muddy ground, remaining motionless for so long that the chaplains sometimes had to check if he was still alive. Charles's dreams, recorded in diary fragments found in his tent after the battle, reveal a mind in total collapse. "Every night my great-grandfather John the Fearless comes to visit me," he wrote in increasingly unstable handwriting. "He shows me his slit throat and says that all dukes of Burgundy must die violently to atone for our lineage's sins. I ask if there is another way, but he only laughs and points to my bloodied sword." Correspondence between Charles and other European nobles during the siege of Nancy shows how his reputation had deteriorated. King Louis XVI of France, traditionally cautious in dealing with the Duke, began referring to him in near-clinical terms, speaking of l'aliénation de l'esprit du duc, the Duke's mental alienation. Pope Sixtus IV, initially sympathetic to Charles's appeals for support against the Swiss heretics, ceased all correspondence after receiving a letter in which the Duke claimed to have been personally chosen by Christ to purify Europe with iron and fire. The last attempt at intervention came from Mary of Burgundy, Charles's only daughter, who traveled secretly to Nancy in December 1476. Witnesses to her meeting with her father described a devastating scene. Mary, then 19, found Charles unrecognizable, speaking incoherently about prophetic visions and refusing to look at her directly. "He called me by the names of several dead women," she later confided to her lady-in-waiting, "including my own mother, who died when I was a child. When I tried to embrace him, he recoiled as if my touch burned him." Mary's visit lasted only a few hours, but was enough to convince her that her father was lost. She left Nancy knowing she would probably never see Charles alive again, carrying a farewell letter he had scribbled with shaky fingers. The letter, preserved in the Habsburg archives, contains only one legible line: "Mary, forgive me for leaving you a kingdom of ashes." The rest is a series of indecipherable scrawls, interspersed with grotesque drawings resembling battlefields strewn with corpses. In the final days before the last battle, Charles developed a bizarre fixation on his own mortality. He ordered a coffin built in his camp, claiming he had seen his death in a dream and wanted to be prepared. the carpenter assigned to the task, reported that the Duke insisted on lying in the coffin several times to test the fit, murmuring Latin prayers as if pretending to be dead. Soldiers who witnessed these strange scenes began to whisper that their commander had been possessed by demons. The disintegration of the Burgundian camp in the siege's final days was almost indescribable. With supply lines cut and morale in total collapse, military discipline vanished completely. Soldiers sold their weapons for food, others simply abandoned their positions and fled at night. The camp itself had become an infected quagmire where disease spread freely, and the dead were left where they fell because no one had the energy to bury them properly. Amid this disintegration, Charles maintained a macabre routine that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. Every morning, he emerged from his tent clad in different armor, as if preparing for a military parade rather than commanding a collapsing army. He insisted on conducting daily inspections of the troops, walking among starving, sick soldiers while delivering motivational speeches that grew increasingly incoherent and bizarre. Charles's last coherent words were recorded by his confessor, Father Antoine of Luxembourg, on the night before the final battle. During what would be his final confession, Charles is said to have declared, "Father, I have sinned against God by believing I could command destiny as though I were the creator. Now I see I was but an instrument of providence, forged to show the world the vanity of human ambition. Tomorrow I will pay the price for my hubris, and perhaps in death I will finally find the peace that eluded me in life." The morning of the last battle brought a meteorological phenomenon many contemporaries interpreted as a divine omen. A thick, unnatural fog covered the entire battlefield, but only around the Burgundian camp, while the enemy lines remained clearly visible under a clear sky. Charles interpreted this as a favorable sign, claiming God had sent the mist to hide his movements, but his men saw it as a bad omen that left them even more demoralized. Charles's preparation for his final battle was an elaborate ritual, combining elements of military ceremony, religious devotion, and growing paranoia. He spent 2 hours being outfitted in ancestral armor, piece by piece, while murmuring the names of all the Dukes of Burgundy who preceded him. Each piece of equipment was blessed by the camp chaplain, and Charles insisted on carrying sacred relics he had collected during years of pilgrimages and conquests. The moment Charles mounted his horse for the last time was described by multiple witnesses as simultaneously majestic and deeply unsettling. Despite his physically deteriorated condition, he managed to radiate an aura of authority that temporarily silenced even the most skeptical among his men. His horse, a black destrier named Murta, his companion in dozens of battles, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing perfectly still as its rider delivered what would be his final speech. "Men of Burgundy," Charles shouted in a voice that echoed across the field. "Today, we fight not only for territories or wealth, we fight for Europe's very soul, against those who wish to reduce us to servants of lesser kings. I would rather die a lion than live a lamb. May God recognize you." The speech, though brief, managed to ignite a final spark of loyalty in his exhausted men, many of whom cried his name with a passion that grotesquely contrasted with their gaunt, sickly appearance. The initial charge led by Charles was, by all accounts, a spectacle of desperate courage that even impressed his enemies. Riding at the head of his men with sword held high, he cut through the first enemy lines like a force of nature, his blade gleaming in the dim morning light as it carved a path through a sea of pikes and halberds. For a few moments, it seemed, his personal bravery might compensate for all of his army's weaknesses, but tactical reality soon overpowered individual heroism. The Burgundian army, outnumbered 3-1 and poorly coordinated, was quickly enveloped on the flanks. Charles, realizing the battle was lost, made a decision that would define his legend. Instead of attempting to escape or surrender, he chose to fight to the death, battling with a ferocity bordering on madness while his men fell around him. Charles's final moments are reconstructed from fragmented accounts by soldiers on both sides who were close enough to witness his death. Surrounded by enemies and with his horse mortally wounded, the Duke continued fighting on foot, his sword slicing wildly through the air as blood spurted from dozens of wounds in his armor. A Swiss soldier reported seeing Charles laugh as he fought, a sound described as the laugh of a man who had finally found what he sought. Charles's final death did not come from a single heroic strike, but from the cumulative weight of multiple wounds and utter exhaustion. Witnesses describe how he staggered, tried to brace himself on his sword, then sank to his knees in the blood-soaked mud. Even then, he tried to keep fighting, swinging his weapon in ever wilder arcs until he finally collapsed, his breathing growing labored until it ceased altogether. The silence that followed Charles's death was described as supernatural by multiple sources. For a few moments, the battle seemed to pause around his fallen body, as if both allies and enemies recognized that something significant had ended. Then, like a released tide, the violence resumed with renewed intensity as the last Burgundian defenders were systematically wiped out. The desecration of Charles's body began almost immediately after his death. Enemy soldiers, many of whom had lost comrades in previous campaigns against the Duke, stripped him of his valuable armor and left his corpse naked in the snow. Some urinated on the body or kicked it, unleashing years of accumulated fear and rage. Charles's transformation, from feared conqueror to humiliated corpse, was complete within minutes. The search for the body in the following days revealed the grotesque state in which Charles had been left. Wild dogs and crows had begun feeding on the dead, and the Duke's face was so mutilated that even his closest servants struggled to recognize him. The dignity he had maintained, even in his lowest moments, was utterly destroyed by death and the elements. The psychological impact of discovering the body on Margaret of York was devastating and lasting. When Olivier de la Marche returned to Brussels with confirmed news of Charles's death and a detailed description of his body's condition, Margaret reportedly screamed with such force that glass shattered in her chambers. She spent the next 3 days in a catatonic state, alternating between uncontrollable sobbing and absolute silence that terrified her servants. The improvised funeral in Nancy was a melancholic farce that starkly contrasted with the elaborate funerals Charles had organized for his ancestors. His body, covered by a simple sheet to hide its wounds, was placed in a cheap wooden coffin provided by René of Lorraine's charity. Only a handful of surviving Burgundian soldiers were present, many weeping openly, not only for their commander's death, but for the complete destruction of everything they had fought for. The immediate fragmentation of Burgundian territories after Charles's death demonstrated how fundamentally personal and untransferable his power had been. Without his intimidating presence to hold them together, the various territories comprising his domains quickly turned to other protectors. France annexed Burgundy proper. The Habsburgs assumed control of the Low Countries through their marriage with Mary, and numerous lesser nobles declared independence or allied with larger powers. Mary of Burgundy, suddenly heir to a fractured legacy, faced challenges that would have tested her father even in his strongest days. At 19, she found herself responsible for war-torn territories, an empty treasury, and subjects who doubted her ability to rule. Her hurried marriage to Maximilian of Austria was as much a political necessity as a desperate attempt to salvage something of her father's Burgundian dream. Charles's last loyal servants scattered across Europe after his death, many carrying stories and relics from their time in ducal service. Some became mercenaries, others entered monasteries, but all bore the psychological scars of having served a man whose greatness and madness had become indistinguishable. Their narratives, recorded in convents and courts over the following decades, formed the foundation of the legend of Charles that would spread throughout Europe. Charles's personal library, dispersed after his demise, revealed intimate aspects of his personality that had remained hidden during his lifetime. Among his books were marginal notes showing a brilliant mind grappling with growing obsessions. In the treatise on governance, he wrote, "Power corrupts not because it makes men evil, but because it makes them believe they can transcend their humanity." In another, on military strategy, "Victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the one most willing to sacrifice everything." The artworks Charles commissioned in his final years reflected his increasing obsession with mortality and legacy. A series of unfinished tapestries found in his Brussels apartments depicted scenes from Alexander the Great's life, but with Alexander's figure gradually transforming into Charles's through the panels. The last tapestry, left incomplete, showed Alexander Charles being crowned by the gods, but the divine faces were grinning skulls. Charles's influence on military art endured long beyond his death. His tactical innovations, especially the coordinated use of artillery and infantry, were studied and adapted by generals across Europe. Paradoxically, it was his Swiss enemies who best applied his lessons, developing techniques that would dominate European battlefields for decades. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Charles had created the very weapons that precipitated his downfall. Charles's grand dreams influenced an entire generation of European nobles, many of whom saw him as a model to follow, until his death demonstrated the perils of unchecked ambition. His example served as an objective lesson on the limits of individual power, and as an inspiration to those who dreamed of similar glories. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Mary of Burgundy's father-in-law, consciously modeled much of his public persona on Charles, but with far more caution and diplomatic skill. Charles's transformation from historical figure to literary symbol began almost immediately after his death. Chroniclers and poets across Europe started crafting increasingly elaborate versions of his life and demise, emphasizing different aspects of his personality based on their own political and artistic agendas. To some, he became a symbol of chivalric nobility in decline. To others, a cautionary tale of pride's destructive power. Diplomatic correspondence in the years following Charles's death reveals how his absence fundamentally shifted Europe's balance of power. King Louis XIII of France, traditionally cautious because of the Burgundian threat, became much more aggressive in expansionist policies. The Holy Roman Empire, through the Habsburg marriage to the Burgundian inheritance, gained access to territories and resources that would permanently alter Central European politics. The ultimate fate of Charles's personal belongings became part of his legend. His sword, recovered from the battlefield, passed through many hands before disappearing entirely. During the 16th century religious wars, his ducal crown was melted down by the French to finance military campaigns, a practical end that would have appalled the man who had worn it with such pride. His armors were distributed as trophies or sold to collectors, physically fragmenting. The symbol of his power, Margaret of York dedicated her remaining years to preserving her husband's memory, but her efforts often revealed more about her own traumatized psyche than about Charles's historical reality. She commissioned biographies, presenting an idealized version of the Duke, omitting or downplaying his most disturbing traits. These works, though historically questionable, helped shape the romantic image of Charles that would influence writers and artists for centuries. Charles's death effectively marked the end of the Burgundian Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era dominated by modern nation-states. his attempt to create an independent kingdom between France and the Holy Roman Empire had been the last grand expression of the feudal ideal of personal power based on loyalty and individual military prowess. His collapse demonstrated that the future belonged to more complex, bureaucratic political entities. The echoes of his life and death reverberated through the centuries in literature and popular culture. Shakespeare may have drawn on elements of Charles's story to create some of his tragic kings. More recently, George R.R. Martin explicitly acknowledged Charles as one inspiration for characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, especially in how absolute power can corrupt and destroy even initially noble and capable individuals. Modern analysis of Charles the Bold shows a man caught between two eras, born into a medieval world where personal power and military honor reigned supreme, yet forced to operate in an increasingly diplomatic, economic, and politically complex context. His failure to adapt to these changes, combined with an inherently extreme personality, created the conditions for his spectacular downfall. Charles's final legacy does not lie in conquered territories or established dynasties, but in the enduring lesson about the consequences of unchecked ambition. His life serves as a case study of how the very qualities that elevate an individual to power, courage, determination, vision, can become the seeds of his destruction when taken to extremes. In Nancy's Bloodied Snow, not just a man died, but an entire conception of how power should be wielded in the emerging modern world. The story of Charles the Bold remains one of the most powerful examples in humanity's literature of ambition's tragic nature and hubris's inevitable consequences. His end, naked and unrecognizable in the freezing mud, stands as an eternal reminder that no matter how high one may rise, all men are mortal, and earthly power is ultimately an illusion as fragile as the life that sustains it.